Hello, you're listening to Conversing the Classics. We live in a society that constantly questions religion and the existence of God. The concept of a culture that did not question religious beliefs seems so alien to our own, it's almost unimaginable. Well, imagine then a culture that had religion so embedded in its society that they didn't even have a word for it. Joining me today to discuss religion in ancient Greece is Robert Parker, Wykeham, is that right? Yeah. Professor of Ancient History Emeritus and Fellow of New College at the University of Oxford. Professor Parker, thank you so much for joining me today. To open the discussion, what are the earliest dates we can trace religion in ancient Greece to, where it is recognisably the polytheistic religion of Zeus, Athena, etc., that we are so familiar with?
Well, I think the answer to that's the 13th or possibly the 14th century BC. This is the period of the so-called Mycenaean culture in Greece, which was based on the great fortress at Mycenae. And from that period, we have texts in what's called Linear B, which is a difficult script which wasn't deciphered until, when was it, in about 1953. And what was very exciting about the decipherment of Linear B was it turned out that Linear B was an early form of Greek, and it also gave us the names of some of the familiar Greek gods. Not all of them, and there are some gods there we don't recognise, but basically we can say that in the Linear B texts we have quite a bit of the familiar Greek set of gods. And possibly some of these texts are also found in Crete, which seems to have been under control of Mycenae, and they may go back to the 14th century BC. Okay. So that's how far back we get.
Mm. And when we talk about Greek religion, it's obviously quite a broad spectrum. Do its practices and beliefs change over time, or do they vary depending on what part of Greece you're observing?
Well, if I can talk first about the geography of it, the crucial point about Greece is that it wasn't politically unified. It was split up among, we don't know exactly how many, but people think sometimes up to about 1,000 different polis. Polis is a word that translates as city, but actually a lot of these would be more like large villages. So there's no such place as Greece politically, it's just these 1,000 different polis. Well, they have religious systems that resemble one another but aren't the same. Most of them have most of the familiar gods, but some of the gods are much more prominent in some places than others are, so it's very much up and down. And for instance, in Athens, the top god, the goddess who protects the citadel, is Athena, but in Argos, she's Hera, and there are sort of variations like that throughout Greece. Though I think there are not many cities that didn't have most of the major gods at some level. There's also in Greek religion a very important category of individuals called the heroes. Heroes are people who were believed to have been mortals from the past, but because they were exceptional in some way, they had some kind of star quality, they'd retained their powers after death, and you could pray to them and get benefits from them, or they could harm you if they were angry with you. But because they were people who'd once been mortals, they belonged to a particular place. So the different polis would have a different set of heroes whom they worshipped. So to that extent, it's all very different, but the basic forms of religious life seem to me the same everywhere. The ways in which you worship the gods seem much the same. Everywhere has gods, everywhere has heroes. A dear colleague of mine wrote a book called Religions of the Ancient Greeks, in the plural. Well, I think that was a little exaggerated. I'm still happy to talk about religion of the Greeks, but it's a borderline kind of thing. As for change in time, well, yes, of course, everything changes in time to some extent, but one couldn't say it was really drastic. I think if you were an Athenian of the 5th century BC and you moved forward 700 years, you'd probably still think that the religion was pretty recognisable. There would be some new gods around. There was always the possibility of so-called foreign gods being introduced into Greece. The most successful among these was the Egyptian goddess Isis, who really became quite important. And also there's the phenomenon that is very puzzling to us of worshipping rulers. Alexander the Great becomes worshipped in some places, and so do quite a lot of other monarchs from the so-called Hellenistic period, so that's the 3rd to 1st century BC. Then Roman emperors start being worshipped. Well, what all this means, exactly what people felt when they were performing sacrifice to a human, is quite a puzzling question. But this is quite a big change, but this is still something that goes on alongside the traditional Greek religion. One of the big changes that occurs rather later is that sacrifice, animal sacrifice, sort of seems to slide out of favour in the 3rd, 4th centuries of the Christian era. But apart from that, the forms of worship stay roughly the same until Christianity comes. It's Christianity that gets rid of Greek religion.
And you just mentioned there, sort of earlier on, you talked about the idea that there were heroes who were kind of a step below gods. And then you talk about the canonization of people like of Alexander the Great and Roman emperors. Are the heroes and people like Alexander put on the same par, or are they sort of a step below the heroes?
Alexander, people like that are actually normally treated as gods, not as heroes.
So they're a step above.
Well, I don't think they quite saw it in that way anyway.
Okay.
They're just yet one more added to the extraordinary mix of powers that there are, because there's all sorts of minor gods as well, nymphs and Pan and satyrs and things like that. You could never sort anything out in Greek religion. There's no coherence to it.
Yeah. And then on foot of that, did the Greeks have sort of a canon text in the same way that Christianity has the Bible, Islam has the Quran, so on and so forth? Did the Greeks have something like this, or was it?
Absolutely not. This is the central truth. There was no text that had any authority. There were texts which told the stories and which were very influential. So the epic poetry of Homer telling lots of myths, and there's also the early poetry of Hesiod, who's probably 7th century or 8th century BC, who wrote a poem called Theogony. Theogony means the generation of the gods, so it's telling you the story of what god gave birth to what other god. So people took their ideas of the gods from these texts, but they didn't actually have to believe any of them. And there's no problem at all about disbelieving them. Already about the year 500, there's a very important philosopher called Xenophanes who says, he's writing in verse, I'll have to translate it into prose, obviously. Homer and Hesiod ascribed to the gods all the things that are a shame and disgrace among mortals: lying, deceiving and stealing, committing adultery and deceiving one another. Yes, which is true. You get all of that in the poetry of Homer. So, but Xenophanes is entirely free to say that. You could reject any given myth and say, I don't believe that's true. The gods aren't like that.
So you said that it was common to sort of all of Greece, all religion. But if they didn't have a canon text, how did the principles stay the same? Or was it just very strong oral tradition kept all the practices in the one ballpark?
Well, I think they all had the same stories, roughly, because these poems are known throughout Greece. The myths are, by and large, shared by everybody. So everybody, and the sculptural representations are similar. So they have the same sort of conceptions in their head, but none of it is enforced by any kind of authority. I mean, saying you don't believe in the gods is possibly problematic, but what particular belief you hold about them is entirely up to you.
And then you mentioned at the start that the origins of Greek religion lie in kind of the 14th century BC, around that time. But do we have any idea where the origins of belief come from, or is there a sort of a proto-religion before that we have any idea about, or is it the clay tablets that really it?
Well, that's all we know about. I've spent my career saying to my students, we don't do origins, because it used to be the case that early students of religion tried to explain the origin of religion. Well, I don't think you can really do that. Actually, quite recently, people have started trying to return to that question and to try to understand in evolutionary terms why religious belief, because religious belief of some kind is a universal. All peoples have it. Well, why? Well, one view would be because the gods are really there. The other view is there's something about the human animal that causes the human animal to be susceptible to believe in gods. And some people believe both those things, actually. They're not mutually exclusive. But so you can talk sensibly about, well, it's interesting, though inconclusive, trying to understand why humans are predisposed to believe in gods. But about the origins of Greek religion, there's nothing special, I think, you can really usefully say.
Okay.
And I think it's much more important to look at what's actually going on in the period we can look at when we've got the evidence.
Absolutely. Now, this is quite a loaded question, so if you want to break it down into kind of a few subparts, that would probably be best. But what were the beliefs of the ancient Greeks? How did they see the structure of the gods and the kind of the power that existed within the gods? What was their view?
I suppose the key point here is that they didn't think that they knew, in a strong sense, very much about that at all. There's a famous passage in which the philosopher, the historian Herodotus, says he doesn't want to talk too much about Egyptian views of the gods because he thinks that all peoples know the same amount about the gods, and by that he means nobody knows anything, really. Of course, people had sort of conceptions about the gods, but there's no authority imposing, and it's very, very different from Christianity. In Christianity, at least, well, I suppose it's still true, you go to church and on certain occasions you recite something which is a creed, and a creed comes from the Latin word I believe, and indeed it's a list of things that you're supposed to believe. You may not believe them, but you're required to recite it. And of course, in early Christianity, there were tremendous theological battles about these questions. What is the relation of God to Christ? Are they one being or are they two? Very complicated questions. Well, absolutely nothing of that kind in Greece, and you can find simple contradictions on basic points. If you ask yourself who the father of Aphrodite is, well, in Homer, you're told that Aphrodite is the daughter of Zeus, but in Hesiod, the other influential early poet, it turns out that Aphrodite is actually born from the spray that surrounded the genitals of Uranos, the god of heaven, when they were cut off by his son Kronos and thrown into the sea. Well, we ought to be told who is the father of Aphrodite. Why don't they worry about it? Well, they don't. They just live with that. So, don't expect anything systematic or coherent. I suppose the basic position is that gods or something divine, one could even put it more vaguely, there is something out there. Sometimes they speak about the divine, not about gods at all, and you ought to worship it, and you'll be in trouble if you don't, and the way to worship it is according to tradition. And the reason you know tradition is the right way to do it is because we're still here. So it must be, we must be doing something right. The basic relation you want to establish with the gods is a relation, there's a very Greek word charis, which is very hard to translate because sometimes it means gratitude and sometimes it means charm or favour. But what a charis relation with the gods means is an attempt whereby you give them presents which please them, and in gratitude for that, they then give good things back to you, and then in gratitude for that, you do pay more tribute to them, and so it goes on in an eternal cycle. So you pray to the god, I'm bringing you a graceful offering, and please take pleasure in this, be grateful for it, and give me a grateful return. So this endless cycle, so there's a sense of dependence on the gods, which you keep going by continuing to worship them and bring them gifts. I suppose also there was a difference between Christianity and Greek religion is there's much more emphasis on behaviour in Christianity and in most of the book religions. You go to church, you listen to a sermon, you're told how you ought to behave. Nothing like that in Greek religion. So in a sense, it seems as though Greek religion sits rather loose in relation to morality, as though they're two entirely different things. But there was the belief that there were certain ways in which the gods were involved in human conduct. And I particularly stress here the idea of the oath, swearing an oath, because you had to do that in quite a lot of contexts in Greece. If you make a treaty, you swear an oath. You might swear an oath to someone you're going to marry. In some kind of commercial contracts, you would ratify them with oaths. And there was a general sense that if you broke an oath, perhaps something bad was going to happen to you because you swore an oath in the name of a god. You might swear the oath in the name of a god on the heads of your children. So you'd think, well, okay, if I break that oath, that's not going to be so good for Junior. Of course, there were people who just crossed their fingers and put it behind their back and didn't believe in that kind of thing. But on the whole, I think most people would have been uneasy about breaking an oath. So in that sense, the gods do come into questions of behaviour as well.
And on that sort of idea that the gods are judging you, or you need to please the gods with these offerings, did they have a concept of heaven and hell, the idea that when you died, if you were good to the gods or if you were good in life, they would reward you for it?
Well, the point I'd really wish to emphasise here is that this is another of the really big differences between Greek religion and Christianity. Christianity is fundamentally about the afterlife, isn't it? The task of the Christian is to live well in order to rejoin his or her Maker in a blessed afterlife. That's a traditional understanding of Christianity. This life is just a phase. Well, that's really not the point of Greek religion. Greek religion is about this life, about this world, about getting wealth, about having children, and being healthy, the crops growing, all that kind of thing. So the afterlife is, in my mind, a kind of afterthought. Of course, they did think about it. And already in the poetry of Homer, there's a famous scene in Odyssey, Book 11, where the hero Odysseus goes down to the underworld, but it turns out the underworld is a very gloomy place for most people. What survives isn't so much you yourself as a kind of negative image of you. The souls, they are there, but they're sort of flitting around. They've got no strength, no power. So there's no fun down there. Also in Homer, you get the idea that a certain select few, very few, go off to the Isles of the Blessed. So that's a kind of heaven, but not for you or me. There's also a select few of bad guys who've done really bad stuff, like trying to rape a goddess, who are getting severely punished. But most people are not going to go in either of those directions. Well, I think things broaden out a bit later, and we do sometimes get references to ordinary people going to the place of the pious. We also get occasional references to people being nervous about punishment. As you get older, you start worrying whether all those stories may be true or not. There are also special cults, in particular the so-called Eleusinian mysteries, which told you that if you went to them and got initiated, paid the fees, went through the whole experience, you were going to be okay in the afterlife. You weren't going to be lying in the mud like other people. You were going to have a good time. In fact, sometimes we even hear about a symposium, a drinking party of the blessed. And there was nothing kooky about getting initiated in one of these cults. Eleusinian Mysteries was actually an official cult of the Athenian state. People went to it from all over Greece, but it never became a fixed and firm belief of anybody. I mean, I believe that if I've got poison in this mug and I drink it. That's an absolute belief. I don't think anybody in Greece believed that they were destined to a blessed afterlife, however well they lived, or indeed to punishment afterwards like that.
And what's interesting, forgive me if I'm being too specific, but you referenced Book 11 of Homer's Odyssey, and there's an interesting line in that where he's speaking to Achilles, who obviously died at the end of the Trojan War, and he says something, I wish I could quote it verbatim, but it's something to the effect of, I would rather plough the fields under the whip for a lifetime than be a king down here for an eternity. Now that's interesting because Achilles is seen as sort of an epic hero. Why was it then that Homer decides to put him in this kind of limbo, I suppose is the word I could use, as opposed to going off to these blessed fields? Or is that too complicated to kind of even address?
Well, there was an alternative myth, we don't know that it was ignored by Homer or had come up later, that Achilles is actually there on an island in the Black Sea, having the whale of a time. So he's getting what he deserves. It's possibly just because Homer wants to make the point that even this greatest of heroes, but it's a wonderful picture of the Homeric picture of the afterlife. Because Odysseus says to Achilles, "Oh, here you are. You're pretty important down here. You're not doing so badly." And Achilles then responds with those wonderful lines that you quoted. I'm trying to remember if I can remember the Greek. I'd prefer to be with to be a slave with somebody who wasn't rich. E parsin necuesin kataphtheminoisin anasin, rather than rule over all the perished dead. Yes.
Excellent. Removing ourselves from the text for just a moment, because we could get wrapped up in that for a very long time, and back to the practicalities of day-to-day practices. How did the Greeks worship their gods, and did they have significant religious festivals like the way that we'd have Christmas and Hanukkah and so on?
Well, yes, of course they worshipped the gods, and they certainly had festivals. I suppose the way they worshipped them, the idea of gifts is very important. Gifts persuade the gods, gifts persuade reverend kings. That's something you get already in Hesiod. You've got to bring gifts to the gods. If you went to a sanctuary, you might, if you were rich, bring something very expensive. You might dedicate a beautiful statue, or you might just go along with a little figurine made out of clay, or a little bit of tin or something with a little picture of a goddess on it. So it might cost you very lot, almost nothing, or might cost a great deal, but you don't normally go to a sanctuary with empty hands. So that's one thing. Then there's sacrifice, absolutely fundamental form of offering, and that too is seen as a gift. That's the only thing they ever say about it. Explicitly, why you do it, it's a gift. Well, other forms of worship, processions are very important. Usually if you're doing a sacrifice, there's a procession involved as well. Dancing is very important. Singing and dancing. Most young Greeks will have been involved in choral dancing, so 12, 20, 50 of them dancing in a ring with various degrees of training. And quite a lot of that went on in later life as well. And tragedy develops out of the choral dances, and it itself, in its content, it's not a religious thing, but it's performed at a religious festival. The Dionysia, which tragedies are performed, is a festival in honour of the god Dionysus. Athletic games are also, in fact, religious events. Well, as for festivals, I couldn't begin to tell you how many there are. There's so many. And you can't quite say, it's not like Christmas and Easter as being the sort of the basic Christian festivals. It varied a bit. One very important, well, just to give an example, the Panathenaic at Athens, that's one that's very familiar because the famous Parthenon marbles in the British Museum in London depict a central act. A central act was a great procession involving people from all classes of society, which went up to the Acropolis in Athens carrying a new robe which had been woven by specially chosen young women. They'd been spending the previous 9 months doing it, and it was then presented to the goddess. But also involved in this procession are a lot of animals who are going to be sacrificed. This mass sacrifice of animals then leads to a mass banquet everyone participates in, but also part of the Panathenaic are games, so quite large-scale athletic competition. There's also an all-night rite. An all-night rite means a lot of choruses of young girls and women performing dances. We don't know what they were like because it's rather secret. It was done by night, but so there's this kind of mixture of elements, but it's all fun. There are not many festivals that are gloomy. There are also special festivals for women. there was one called Thesmophoria for Demeter and Kore, so the goddess of corn, and her daughter, the goddess of the underworld, where, in fact, as it seems, all the married women of the city went away from their homes for 3 days and sat in a special place and performed various different rituals, and I'm sure gossiped like mad and complained about how awful their husbands were. This was a very remarkable moment in ancient life, because here are these women going away from home for 3 days. Usually, Greek men are very Sicilian. They want to keep their wives under strict control. This is an occasion when actually the women were allowed out, but it is important that there were important religious roles for women. This was a place where women were not as downtrodden as they are in other aspects of Greek life.
And then, of course, you had sort of female-oriented cults, like the Maenads, that's the Greek version of them, isn't that?
That's right,
Yeah.
yes, of course, yes.
Now, you mentioned it a few times as we were going along about animal sacrifice, which is synonymous. I mean, most people, they think of Greek religion, they think of animal sacrifice, and ancient religion in general, for that matter. You said that it's the idea of an offering. Is it an idea that you're sending an animal to the afterlife for the gods? And what was the common practice when sacrificing animals?
Well, I've been banging my head against this problem for all my career. My firm conviction is that any attempt to explain sacrifice by a single explanation is simply doomed to failure. It's a complex thing. I think there's 2 main points in it. Sacrifice, the question is why this thing has religious power, why people think that it somehow gets through to the gods. And one part is that death, and a death that's designed, it's deliberately inflicted. So this is something that's solemn, it's awe-inspiring, but of course, unless you're vegetarian, it's got to happen from time to time. It's a necessary but solemn act. The other aspect of sacrifice, in most cases, not in all, because there were some sacrifice where the meat wasn't eaten, but in most cases it leads to a feast. Well, a feast is something very different. It's not awe-inspiring, but it's absolutely central to all human life. Still today, in every society, to my knowledge, eating together is the fundamental social bond. You can't have a party without eating together. You can't celebrate a wedding or death or anything else without eating together. So it's these 2 absolutely fundamental aspects, the experience of death and the experience of feasting, eating together, that come together to make sacrifice powerful. Somehow this links up with the gods as well. The gods share in the experience, and sacrifice is a way in which you communicate with the gods, because actually, even on occasions when you don't want to have a feast, but if you really need to get through to the gods, you will perform a sacrifice. It's a basic form of communication. So I like to think in sacrifice in terms of a triangle: killing, dining, communication with the gods, and different occasions on which sacrifice is performed are emphasizing one thing more than another. Sometimes it's more about killing, because don't always dine at all. Sometimes it's more about dining. Sometimes it's more about communicating with the gods. But it has these different meanings on different occasions, but it's never worked out, because they don't theorize it. They just speak of it as a gift to the gods. I think the last part of your question was how they do it. I think I'm going to pass on that, because it would take me half an hour.
Oh, okay.
I should just say that the main difference is that some sacrifices lead to a feast, some don't.
Oh, okay. Now, they have all these practices and festivals, but do they have a church hierarchy? Are there the equivalents of priests and bishops, or indeed any significant religious figures?
No, I think really you can say they don't. They do, of course, have priests, but the priest is always attached to a particular sanctuary. You're not even a priest of Apollo. You're a priest of Apollo in a particular place. And if there's another sanctuary of Apollo in your same city, that will have its own priest. and priests never get together. There's no such thing as a synod of Greek priests where they discuss matters of common concern, and there's no hierarchy within priests. So they are important in terms of the day-to-day running of religion and looking after sanctuaries, but they don't decide anything. Decisions about religion are taken basically by the same body that takes other decisions. This is hard for us to understand, but in a democracy, the Democratic Assembly takes decisions, and we have decrees passed by the Athenian Assembly which decide to establish a cult of such and such a god and set up the terms of the tenure of office by the priest or priestess and the salary he or she is to get, stuff like that. So actually, the most influential people in religion are politicians, because it's part of being a politician. You have to stand up from time to time and make a speech. And there's a guide to being a politician, rhetoric, which explains how you argue both sides, whether you should be spending more on sacrifices this year, whether you should be spending less on sacrifices this year. And this manual tells you the way to argue it both ways. So it's part of a politician's job. There are also other people who might give advice in the assembly, in particular seers. A seer might stand up and make a speech on a religious matter in an assembly, but he has no authority. It's just that because he's a kind of religious professional, people might think he'd be worth listening to. But the basic truth is there's no hierarchy, no structure, no real authority.
And then from that, obviously, you have you don't have sort of a bond between all religious leaders and seers. So then what would the process be if you wanted to become a priest or if you wanted to become a seer? Was there a particular line you had to follow, or did you just show up at the temple and say, this is what I am now?
To become a seer, you would usually, you might belong to a family of seers, or you might, I suppose, go into apprenticeship with a previous seer, or buy a book from a previous seer. To be a priest, well, in many cases that was a family business too, or it belonged to a kind of extended family.
So there was no celibacy among priests in the same way that there would be in sort of Catholicism today?
Just temporary celibacy occasionally, but not permanent celibacy. Just a few cases of virgin priestesses, but mostly you just have virgins who do it for a bit and then get married. Celibacy is really not a big thing, no. At a certain point, in Athens anyway, priesthoods became democratized, and anybody could go in for certain priesthoods by lot, essentially. Your name would be chosen out of the people who wish to do it. You could also put yourself a candidate to be in the lot to hold the priesthood in Athens.
And then how did seers and priests, how did they interpret the will of the gods? What were their methods for kind of saying, this is what the gods are feeling, they're angry, they're pleased with us? What?
Well, this is done partly through omens that offer themselves, an eagle on the right, or a clap of thunder, or a burst of rain at a particular moment, but also it's particularly through forms of divination. Divination can be done, on the one hand, in association with sacrifice. You probably know about looking at the entrails of animals. Each time an animal was sacrificed, they took a look at the entrails, but sometimes you could actually do a sacrifice specially in order to ask a question. Had Mrs. May been a Greek, she would have sacrificed an animal and said, shall I call an election or shall I not? And the gods would have told her, no, don't. And she'd be doing better. The other way is to consult an oracle, and this is extremely important. And I should have said when I was talking about there being no religious authority, sometimes a citizen assembly would decide this question is one we can't settle. We need to go to the gods themselves about it. And in that case, you could send a representative to consult the oracle of Apollo at Delphi or the oracle of Zeus at Dodona. And this was also open to private individuals. And we have, so on the one hand, if a city was wondering where it should, if it could recite a temple, it might consult an oracle about that, but also if you were wondering whether to marry your girlfriend, you could actually go and consult Zeus at Dodona about that. We have thousands of actual question tablets that contain the questions that were put to Zeus at Dodona. We don't have most of the answers, but we know very in detail the kind of questions that people put to the gods, and they're extremely down to earth. Should I keep sheep? Is the child Anila pregnant with mine or not? Will my wife have a male child? Etc., etc., etc.
And that comes on to kind of the other part I'd like to ask. That you talk about that there's obviously asking if you're going to marry, should I marry my girlfriend? Should I, or is this child mine? Is it going to be a boy or a girl? How did they perceive marriage and childbirth in terms of religion? I mean, were they very, very linked, or were they?
Well, I think they were very linked in the sense that you would certainly, if you were a pious person, want to seek a lot of divine protection in those regards. Aristotle says that it's good for pregnant women to go walking out to the shrines of the goddesses or the gods who protect pregnant mothers. He says it's good for their health, but it's obviously... and we know there's rituals that are involved both at the time of marriage and for pregnant women. So most areas of life, most important areas of life, have got rituals and gods connected with them, because, as I said, these are very practical kind of religion.
Now, considering they themselves didn't have a word for religion, and it was so intertwined with their own day-to-day life, how did they perceive other religions? I mean, obviously someone like Herodotus writes quite broadly about the religions of the East and North Africa, but how would the Greeks have received that? Because it seems a little odd that they have this such a fixed mindset about this is religion, this is part of everyday life, there's no questioning it, I suppose. How did they look at other religious cultures?
Well, I think for religion, substitute gods.
Okay.
The closest Greek equivalent to the concept of religion is the things of the gods, taton, theon, and when they looked outside Greece, they saw other gods. Though a complicating factor is they sometimes thought these other gods were actually their own gods under a different name. It's a famous thing that Herodotus sometimes translates the name of, let's say, an Egyptian god into Greek. He says Osiris is the Egyptian for Dionysus, but he does know there's a different name out there. What he does talk about foreign cultures, is different rituals. Talks a lot about that. Different ways in which they perform sacrifice, for instance, that above all. Different ways they do oaths. So he sees a difference definitely at the level of practices. I don't think there's a single statement in Herodotus about beliefs, with the single exception, as far as I know, that he says about the Persians don't think that gods have human shape like the Greeks do. That's the only concept, only reference to a different belief that I can think of in Herodotus.
Okay, and now, coming to the end of the podcast, if there were only 3 key points I could take from today's podcast about Greek religion, what would they be?
Well, I suppose the first is that this was very much a religion of this world. It's not about the afterlife, it's about living in the here and now, keeping healthy and happy. Connected with that, I'd say that most of it is fun. The rituals are enjoyable. A second point would be that the complete absence of doctrine and theology. They don't claim to know very much about the gods, and because of that, a great variety of opinions are tolerated. As I stressed, the question of who the father of Aphrodite is a very open question, and so on with the myths. You can just reject them. So there's no sacred book which tells you truth about the gods. There are no priests whose job it is. The priest's job is to come and hit you if you take your donkey into a sanctuary. It's not to tell you anything about the nature of God. A final point I'd like to make is that I think that religion, not just in Greece but in the ancient world, was non-divisive. the ancients, they're always fighting one another, we know that. That's what books about the ancient world are all about. But they didn't fight one another about religion. And that, I think, is because they didn't have sacred books and they didn't have doctrines, and because actually because, as Herodotus says, Osiris is the Egyptian for Dionysus. There's a certain sense in which they thought they were all worshipping the same gods, though in different ways. They have their own local rituals, but it's the same god up there, just like it's one sun for everybody, one god of wine for everybody too. So, in a world where religion is exceedingly divisive, I look back with affection on the non-divisive character of Greek religion.
Yeah. Well, that brings us nicely to the end of the podcast. Professor Parker, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure.
If you at home enjoyed today's podcast and want to find out more about the work we do, get in touch via our social media sites at Facebook, www.facebook.com/Classical Youth Society Ireland. You could follow us on Twitter at CYSI_, or for any direct inquiries, you can email us cysiofficial@gmail.com. This series of Conversing the Classics was made possible by the Classical Association of Ireland, with today's episode being edited by Michael Fuller. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you all next time.